A new bombshell poll, also by YouGov, has revealed that Nigel Farage would be our next Prime Minister if an election was held tomorrow. This YouGov mega poll of 13,000 respondents found that Reform UK would win 311 seats, which would leave a hung parliament. But the Tories would be reduced to just 45 seats, and Labour a long way behind. So let's bring in our panel on this. Matt, of course, you have a background in polling.
Yeah.
How useful, how accurate do you think these kind of polls are?
Well, this isn't any poll. This is an MRP poll, which is a more sophisticated poll. There have been 2 of these polls by YouGov since the election, the general election last year. Now, this one is telling us a pretty consistent picture as the national polls. It's basically putting Reform and Nigel Farage on course to emerge as the largest single party. So Nigel Farage, under that context, would be Prime Minister. They would have an enormous increase in seats. The Tories would be almost wiped out, but would probably at this point have to work supporting Reform in government. So Reform aren't there yet in terms of having a majority in their own right, but what you can see on the screen is really that political earthquake taking shape. And I have polled Reform voters as to why people are voting Reform. And the top 2 issues, and very few pollsters do this, but it's important, separate out illegal migration and legal migration. Then you find that Reform voters, number 1, say stop the boats, but number 2, lower legal migration, and then number 3, cost of living. That's why the intervention earlier this week by Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef with their plans to scrap the Boris wave, again, another policy with no democratic mandate in this country, was so important, because what Nigel Farage is saying is, look, the boats, critical, have to stop the boats, but let's just be serious with the British people. This is about legal immigration, mass uncontrolled immigration.
Yeah. Martin, what I see when I look at that chart is that the left is decimated. And even if Labour, Lib Dems, the Greens, any other independents joined together and formed some sort of coalition, they still couldn't form a government.
Well, at this point, I'm not sure you can count Labour as the left, can you? Because,
good answer.
Because of, how far Keir Starmer's Labour Party has drifted, to a kind of authoritarian shambles. And, the context of this is really important, because we're literally just over a year since the landslide Labour Party victory, 411 seats. It was a shallow landslide. Some people describe it as a loveless landslide, because people were just so sick of the Conservative government after 14 years. But to go this bad after literally just 14, 15 months in government is, I think, unprecedented.
Can I ask you a question? I know I'm jumping into Miriam's chair for a minute, but the other thing this polling shows, which I think is quite interesting, is so you're going to get the Greens, you're going to get the Corbyn party, your party, you're going to get the Labour Party, and they're all going to be competing with one another in the same kinds of areas, in urban areas, diverse areas, student areas. Now, that is going to make life for Nigel Farage and Reform so much easier, because they don't have to compete in those areas. So how do all these different left-wing parties then go forward over the next few years? I assume there's going to have to be some kind of deal. Otherwise, you guys are just going to end up, it's going to be what do they call it, a circular firing squad?
Well, my view is there has to be some kind of agreement between if your party emerges and the Green Party, because, the Green Party are, doing as good as they've ever done at the moment. They're, often polling at 12, 13, 14%.
Yeah, they are.
There's been a few polls with your party, theoretically, if they existed, also polling at about 12, 14%. So that my view is there has to be some kind of arrangement between the two parties.
Labour are losing as much support today to the Greens as they are losing to Reform. So what we're going to see is something similar to 2019, where all the Remain type parties were sort of cancelling each other out, which allowed, at that time, the Conservatives and Boris Johnson to realign politics. But this time, the issue won't be Brexit. This time, the issue will be mass immigration.
Well, as a journalist, I always need to remember more in less time. And you know what I really hate? Taking notes. It wastes loads of time and you forget stuff. And that's where Plord comes in. This is the Plord Notes, a sleek, pro-level AI note-taker that records and creates notes for you. Whether you're listening to a long podcast, stuck in a meeting, or on an important call, Claude captures everything at the tap of a button. Then it gives you a smart, structured summary with all of the key takeaways. It even recognises different speakers by their voice, and you can choose from bullet points, to-do lists, or even mind maps. Your data's safe too, with end-to-end encryption and global privacy compliance. And with Claude's built-in AI, you can search everything you've ever recorded just by asking a question. It's slim, magnetic, under 30 grams, lasts up to 60 days on standby, and over 1 million people are already using it. Hit the link in the description and use code GB10 for £10 off your Claude order. Save hours of time and never miss a detail again. Link in the description below.
Now speak with the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, Sir John Curtis. Sir John, it's always a pleasure to have your esteemed company. If anybody can make sense of this data, it's you. The trend seems to be that Nigel Farage has momentum, and this one seems to underline that trend. Talk us through the numbers.
Well, it's certainly true that this poll, as compared with the last time YouGov did this exercise back in May and June, has the Reform lead at 6 points in terms of the share of the vote, as opposed to 3 points then, and that therefore, as a result, its estimate of how many seats Reform would get is markedly greater. I think actually, Martin, it's incorrect if you take the broader swathe of the polls to say that anybody has momentum. The truth is that Reform reached 30% in the opinion polls at the beginning of May, in the immediate wake of the English County Council election results, where it did very well. And that is where it is now. It's just simply holding steady. But of course, individual polls will show their variation. Indeed, I think, the honest truth is that I wouldn't have been surprised if this exercise had shown that Reform would get an overall majority, because that is the direction in which, at the moment, the average lead in the polls is of order of 9 points, rather than the 6 points in this poll. So I think, if anything, that these figures probably don't show momentum, but they are probably relatively conservative about Reform's immediate prospects. But I think the other thing that this poll reveals, in a sense, why both Conservative and Labour are potentially in so much trouble, is that it's not just a case of, the Conservative vote being down by, 5, 6, 7 points everywhere. They're down about 7 points across the country as a whole, and Labour down by about 14 points everywhere. The truth is that what this poll underlines is that Labour's support in particular is falling much more heavily in places they're trying to defend. They are, for example, down by 20 points. In constituencies where Reform was second last time, down about 18 points, where the Greens were second, and 16 points where the Tories were second. In other words, Labour are losing ground more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. Similar pattern for the Conservatives. But of course, what we need to remember here, this is exactly the same pattern that was evident in the sharp decline in Conservative support in last year's general election. Labour are suffering a decline of a similar scale, according to the polls, and lo and behold, much the same consequence ensues. That is, Labour's representation in the House of Commons being very dramatically and radically rowed back.
So, John, there are some really eye-popping facts in this when you look at it, and that is Reform would set to inflict Labour's worst election defeat since 1931. The Conservatives would suffer their worst defeat since 1670, when the Tory party was formed. And in terms of the swing of seat numbers, it would be the biggest swing in British political history. So, John Curtis, all of this points to an incredibly volatile atmosphere where people just seem sick to the back teeth of the big two parties.
Yes, it does, Martin. You're absolutely right. And I think one of the questions that's been facing us ever since last year's general election is whether or not that traditional two-party system of Conservative and Labour dominance would survive. All the opinion polls are suggesting that between them, the two parties are struggling to get 40% of the electorate. That said, we should also bear in mind that this opinion poll, if it were right, says Reform are at 27%. As I said earlier, other polls suggest they're at 30%. The truth is that the reason why Reform would at the moment be potentially heading for an overall majority or something close to it is because of the way in which our first past the post electoral system operates. Now, Reform lost out from it last year because they were third And because their vote is geographically much the same evenly spread across the country, that meant they ended up with 5 seats. But if you are first and are 6 points ahead of everybody else, and the political landscape is fragmented, 27% may well be enough to put you in Downing Street with an overall majority. So I think, again, there is a potential, if we were to have a general election like this, where the outcome in terms of the House of Commons would look highly unrepresentative of the position of the country. That's certainly true of Parliament at the moment, and it's also a risk that apparently is existing so far as the next election is concerned.
So, John, I'm with my political editor, Chris Hope. He has a question for you.
So, John, a very quick question. I was there at the conference earlier when we heard from Sir Keir Starmer. He said the Tory party is withering on the vine, and he said this: I want there to be an open fight now between Labour and Reform. That will happen at the next general election. Is he right, or is he believing too much in the polls?
He's right and he's wrong, Chris. He's right in the sense that clearly Reform are the party that at the moment, according to the polls, are most likely to be taking seats off Labour, because, frankly, the Conservative vote is down as well. Labour are, however, wrong in thinking that the answer to their woes simply lies in attacking Reform. Because actually, if you take the recent polls, yes, Labour have lost about 12% of their 2024 vote to Reform, and they would like to get that back. But they've actually lost almost twice as much in combination to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. And that indeed one of the potential risks for Labour of focusing on Reform is, of course, where have most Reform voters come from? They've come from the Conservatives. And Sir Keir Starmer needs to be careful of not dissuading Reform voters from voting Reform, but then they simply go back towards the Conservatives.
Yep. OK, so John Curtice, fascinating, thorough and unmissable as ever. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. And one final nugget I dug out of this poll is that 3/4 of the seats that Nigel Farage could win, if this poll were true, would be from the Labour Party. So the notion that the Reform UK is disaffected Conservatives seems to be going into the wind now. It seems to be a heads-up battle between Labour and Reform. Perhaps that's why Sir Keir Starmer and others are now treating Nigel Farage as the de facto leader of the opposition. Thank you very much to John Curtice and Chris Hope. Superb stuff. Now, still